So in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at people perhaps less known in the Bible who stood and fought the good fight of faith. And we might even talk about perhaps those who did not fight such a great fight of faith at all, but yet something to be gleaned from their life and how God nonetheless seeks his will and does it and sees it through. If you remember when we talked about Caleb, we identified a few principles to those who fight the good fight of faith. We know those who fight, they know why they fight the fight of faith, why they put forth the effort, why they do what they do. We also know that each of them would have an object of their pursuit. In other words, they have to accomplish something in order to fulfill that purpose that they have. They also know that there is a certain means by which they will fight. What are their weapons of war in their spiritual battles? They also know that there would be a cost, there would be a sacrifice that would have to be made. Each time we stand our ground for the Lord, we give up something very much worthwhile. And lastly, when the fight is over, we sit back and we reflect on what we've been through and ask ourselves the question, was it worth the fight? Was it worth the cost? And then what can we learn from this? So when we looked at Caleb and when we looked through these principles, we found that Caleb, his purpose was to live a life that was pleasing to God, especially in the company of people who would not put their trust in God. The people that were going to be with him now for 40 years, or he with them, he had to learn how to continue this fight, to purpose it in his heart, to please God in everything he did. He had an object of pursuit, and that would be the city Hebron. And it wasn't just for Hebron, the city, because he knew that Hebron stood for the fear and the doubt that the Israelites would have. They would look at the impossibilities that were in front of them. It's impossible to take this city. It's walled. It's fortified. There's giants there. We cannot do this. They knew, Caleb knew, that to them, Hebron represented Egypt. The Egypt where they were in bondage, and the Egypt that they would so often want to go back to. But to Caleb, Hebron meant all the possibilities of God's promises that lay before the people of Israel. So he kept that in his crosshairs, in his sight, the whole time that he would be in the wilderness with their people. How would he fight this fight? How would he do it? Through faith and persistence in what he knew were the promises of God. The promises to him, particularly to him as a person, as a single person. God pointed him out. What would it cost? A whole lot of patience. I'm sure 40 years of waiting. Actually, it would be 45 years before he took the city. A lot of patience. Sometimes those who follow God get caught up in the punishment of those who do not follow him and listen. So he would have to wait earnestly, impatient for his day to come. And when he would sit back someday and ask himself, was it worth the fight? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And more. Because it wasn't just about Caleb. It wasn't just about him. His quest, his purpose to live out a godly life was for his people. He was the leader of the house of Judah. And throughout Judges, when you read that book, particularly in the beginning of Judges, you will see how the tribe, the people of Judah, would be the first to step up when a call went out. He knew how to lead his people. So he would leave a legacy behind. Oh, of course, it was worth the fight. When we look at our champion series that we went through back in July and we look at Caleb, we find that Caleb fits the description of a champion. Caleb had a servant heart. He was a man of integrity. He was faithful in his duties. He would prepare for the tasks that lie ahead. Caleb was strong. He was bold. He would rise to the challenges. He would run his race, and he would run to win, not to place. So he gives us an example that we can follow. 45 years later, Caleb would take the town of Kiriath Arba and he would rename it Hebron, which means binding friendship. He did that to honor God and to honor Abraham because it was there in Hebron, before Hebron was even a city, where they would meet and they would talk, and that a friendship was established between God and a man that he considered his friend. He did that also, I'm sure, because of his relationship with Joshua. A binding friendship was there. So we studied a man, his name was Caleb, a city called Hebron. There was an ancestral connection to that city and his ancestors, Abraham and Isaac. There would be promises made to Caleb. There would be promises kept for Caleb, and he would leave a lasting legacy for his people, and particularly the house of Judah. Today we're going to be talking about a Canaanite woman. Her name is Rahab. We don't know a whole lot about Rahab other than she lived in Jericho. Her parents were still living. She had brothers and sisters, and they probably had children too. As far as her vocation is concerned, at best, she was an innkeeper. At worst, she was a prostitute. The very words and root words used in the original text could mean either. But regardless, she was a commoner. She was a person of no significance at that time. We'll also look at a city. It'll be called Jericho. Unlike Hebron, a city to be gained and to look to, Jericho would be a city that would be shunned because it was doomed for destruction. We're going to look at promises made and promises kept in this story. In other words, we're going to look at the concept of trust. Okay, this is probably the first time Rahab would actually ever trust anyone. There was no ancestral connection between Rahab and the city of Jericho or anything, but she would, like Caleb, leave a lasting legacy because of what she did with her life at this time in history. Two main themes we're going to be looking at and seeing and recognizing in this story. Number one is faith put into action. And we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, that our faith really does us no good unless we put it to use. In other words, it just stays locked up in a box and accomplishes nothing. Rahab would learn how to put trust and faith into action. And we're also going to be talking about taking risks when God calls. And the words trust and risk sometimes can be used interchangeably, but they are actually different. A lot of times we take a lot of risk when we trust in something that we shouldn't trust in. Those are two differences, but they can also be kind of similar. So, looking at the concept of risk, you and I face all kinds of risk, and broadly speaking, I can come up with about 4 different types of risk that you and I take. One is calculated risk. We are confronted with the decision that we have to make. We make that decision based on data, information, experience, knowledge, planning. We have time to think about it. So if you go to buy a car, buy a home, take a job, hire a person, if you enter a relationship, enter marriage, you don't do it the Las Vegas way. You take your time, you get information, you build that relationship. When you come to a time when you can trust, then you take that risk after much thought and care is given into it. But just the opposite of that is spontaneous risk. Spontaneous risk is based off of emotion. Something happens, whoa, we respond to it right away. Sometimes that kind of risk can be very reckless as well because we don't think about it. We just act right away on our emotion. Boom. We took a risk and now we pay the consequence. Examples of that, love at first sight. All emotion. No thinking is going on. Okay? 2 weeks ago, my son and I took a fishing trip. We were in Seward, Alaska, out on the ocean. First day was pretty rough, I have to tell you. The last 2 days were perfect. But anyway, every boat and every boat captain has a man overboard protocol. He tells it to everyone on the boat. If a man goes overboard, this is what you do. This is what everybody does so that we can rescue that man overboard. Well, unfortunately, what typically happens with man overboard is someone doesn't think and they jump in after him. So rather than having one person to save, now there's two people that have to be rescued, and oftentimes that goes pretty sour. So we're not thinking in spontaneous risk-taking. Okay? There is also inspirational risk. Now, this is a little bit of both. There is some emotion tied into this, but we take a little bit of time to think about it. And when we ponder it and we make a decision, but somehow that decision is based on us being inspired. Okay, most of you here, not all of you here, were alive when JFK gave his inaugural address on January 21st, 1961. A lot of us here heard that in real time. Matter of fact, that was the first time in the history of the United States that an inaugural address would be heard across the entire globe. And you and I remember those words. His speech was 16 minutes long. And what would become known as the Ask Not speech, those words you and I quite likely remember. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And so, citizens of the world, ask not what America can do for you, but what we together can do for freedom of man. And he would end his speech and let God's work on earth be our own. Now, his speechwriter, the late Ted Sorensen, would say that this was not his best speech, but it was his most memorable and most effective because it got people off the couch and got them involved in their community. And this is what he was calling for, collectiveness in fighting and standing for the fight of freedom. But if there's an opposite of that, I can remember growing up as a child and a student in school, we see historical newsreels on television or on a tape of Adolf Hitler, who would stand in front of people. And you've seen the reels too, I'm sure, if you're my age or older, pounding the podium, shouting at the top of his lungs, trying to garner the inspiration of the people to get his message across. And when I would watch those reels, I would think he's spewing hatred, spewing dissension, spewing destruction, spewing out words of war. But guess what? He was not. It was only 2 years ago that I actually looked up those speeches that were given in German and what they are in English. They were words of patriotism. They were words of nationalism for Germany, the fatherland. To pull it out of the ashes that it stayed in from World War I and make that nation, I don't want to use this word, but great again. That was his message, and the people were inspired, but what they did not see was that behind that facade was the hate. It was the destruction. It was the war. It was the genocide of millions of people. Everything that we would not want to have. I say that to say this, that not all inspiration is the truth. It's not good. So we need to be careful in how we are inspired. The last type of risk is divine risk. This is risk that we take, but it's based on divine, Holy Spirit inspiration, a word that touches our heart. We know it. We know this is God speaking to us, and we can make this decision based on a real, true, divine connection between our heart, our mind, and what the Holy Spirit has to say. And this is what we will talk about when we talk about Rahab. Were there risk takers in the Bible? Absolutely. There were a lot of them. Noah building a boat for a flood that would come because of torrential rains that they'd never had before. He would put his faith in expectation of something that was going to happen that they have not yet seen. All the way to the disciples who at the word of Christ follow me, they would drop their nets. They would leave their catch on the beach for someone else to contend with, and they would follow him. It was a divine connection between the power and truth of his word to their hearts, even though they really didn't even know him yet. Rahab would have that same experience. Characteristics of risk takers who are found in the Bible, they're ordinary people just like champions with an idea or a call to do something extraordinary. They can look beyond the obvious. They learn not to trust in the security of men, but in the trust of God and his security. They were considerate of others, even though it would come to their own peril. Look at the life of Paul and all he suffered for the gospel's sake and nurturing the churches that he would establish. It's a place where outcomes are determined by a choice. Again, the choice to follow God's lead. The biblical risk takers would make their choice without hesitation, not because they weren't thinking, but because they were comfortable and firm in their faith in God. They could respond yes and move forward. All right, it took Moses a little bit of time to get that, okay? He had to argue with God a little bit. Remember? 5 times? Anyway, so we're going to turn to Joshua chapter 2. And we're going to see what this unlikely woman, heroine, would show us in her life. So, beginning in chapter 2, verse 1, then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go, look over the land, he said, especially in Jericho. So they went and they entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelites have come here to spy out the land. So the king of Jericho sent his message to Rahab, bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, yes, the men came here to me, but I didn't know where they were from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gates, the men left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You might be able to catch them. So we're introduced to Rahab and her meeting with the 2 spies. She takes a big risk without even getting to know these men. She hid them. She hid them up on the roof under a pile of flax. She took great risk. First time in a long time that this woman would probably trust anyone. We also find the city of Jericho. I was going to get into a little bit about its history. Maybe we'll do that some other day. But Jericho itself has an interesting history as well as a destination within the Bible. Let's read on, Joshua 2, verses 8 through 11. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up to the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land and to you, and that a great fear has fallen on us because of you. All that live in this country are melting with fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted. Everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and earth below. Rahab knew what was coming. The people knew what was coming. But she understood 2 events that happened, that took place in history 40 years apart. The crossing of the Red Sea. She probably heard that story when she was a child. What's this all about? There's these people called Hebrews that have this awesome God who can split the sea. Not only that, the people would walk across on dry land. But just a couple months ago, this same people now have destroyed 2 of the Amorite clans and kings. Now they're coming. Our hearts were melting with fear, is the word that she gave to them. God started the process before Joshua and his people even got there. Isn't that just like God? He sees over the next hill. He sees around the next bend in our lives. He knows the challenges we're going to have and the troubles and the hardships and the struggles before they even happen. And He actually has the answer to our dilemmas before we even come to the place of struggle. This is the God that we have. This is the God. Jesus asked us to trust. Trust in God, trust in me. So He takes care of this part already. These men weren't lined up on the walls with their spears and their rocks and their swords and their launchers. They were huddled in fear. They did not know what to do. But the next verse, verse 11, is a confession that can only happen because the Spirit of God touched her heart. Because of you, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and earth below. How could a Canaanite woman declare this and say it with conviction had not the Holy Spirit made a connection with her? Why do we think the two spies found this woman? And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. She does something which she probably had never done. I'm sure she had never done before. She put a little bit of faith, a little bit of trust that she never had into a God that she didn't know. She knew about Him, but didn't know Him. And yet she would put that mustard seed hunk of faith into action. So she would hide the spies and she would cover their backs so that they wouldn't be found. Joshua 2, 12 through 14 and 17 through 21. Verse 12, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show me kindness and kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sister, and all that belongs to them, and that you will save us from death. Our lives for your lives, the men assured her. If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land. These are two spoken things of faith that did not yet happen. She talks about the death and destruction to come. Had it come yet? No. Did she know it was coming? Yes. How did she get that? By faith. They say the same thing, by faith. When the Lord gives us this land, had He physically given it to them? No. Was it about to happen? Yes. Were they assured it was going to happen? Absolutely. Interesting words. For she had let them down by a rope through the window of the house that she lived in was part of the city wall. Now she said to them, go to the hills so the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, then go your way. Then the men said to her, this oath you have made us swear to will not be binding on us unless we enter the land that you have tied a scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father and mother and brothers and all your family into that house. If anyone goes outside your house into the street, his blood will be on his own head, and we will not be responsible. As for anyone who is in the house with you, his blood will be on our head if our hand is laid upon them. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from this oath you made us swear. Agreed, she said, let it be as you say. And she sent them on their way. An interesting binding trust was constructed in this moment of time between people who didn't even know each other because God was in the middle of it. He had hold of their heart. He had hold of their minds. Made on the spot, without hesitation, without meeting of the minds, without going to a committee, without debate, without sending it to the top for approval. They made it then, they made it there in a moment of time. These kind of promises, could they have really been made outside any other circumstance where God was not involved? Absolutely not. What general would send his army into a battle based on the word of an innkeeper at best? I don't think so. He wants to hear it from his generals, right? And everybody else. No, absolutely not. Only the Holy Spirit could accomplish something like this through faith in placing trust in the right source. Oftentimes, do we not derail trust in our own lives? A lot of times, yeah, it's because of fear. A lot of times, it's because of doubt. A lot of times it's because we don't have the faith to carry out something God calls us to. A lot of times it's so because of our prejudice. When we look at people, do we not sometimes judge the book by its cover? If these men had done this with Rahab, they say, find us someone higher up we can deal with. They dealt with the person who held the key to their success, and only because this woman listened to God. Only listen. Awesome. But how often do we forfeit our blessings because we lack the trust? Again, Jesus is calling. Trust God, trust also in me. Verse 24, then they said to Joshua, the Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us. Okay. Confirmation of what they found in Jericho to the first chapter of Joshua, where God would tell Joshua, be strong, be courageous, but I'm going to be with you because the battle's mine. I'll be with you, but you got to stick with me. You got to trust me. Now the trust kind of makes a full circle. Joshua knows. Joshua knows. Let's keep looking. Joshua 3:5. Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. They prepare for the battle that lay ahead by consecrating themselves. Verses 7 and 8, and the Lord said to Joshua, today I'll begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so they know that I am with you as I was with Moses. Tell the priests who carry the ark of the covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river. Verse 15, now the Jordan was at flood stage during the harvest, yet as soon as the priests carried the ark and reached the Jordan, their feet touched the water's edge, and the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap, while the water flowing down to the Sea of Arabah, or the Salt Sea, was completely shut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed crossing on dry ground. And then in chapter 4, verses 4 through 7, something interesting kind of happens here. So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, go before the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of tribes of Israel, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. Okay, a couple of things going on. They prepare themselves. God affirms Joshua's leadership before the people. They will cross a body of water for the second time on dry ground. Think about that. If you've ever been walking in a stream or a river or in a lake, take the water away and what's left under your feet? Mud. He didn't want them getting stuck in the mud. Okay, when Egypt's soldiers were behind them, yeah, they would have all been in the mud, but God does not want us wallowing in mud. He wants us standing on firm ground. So the message is, when we trust God, He doesn't do it to leave us in the mud. He leaves us on firm ground so our feet will have footing and we can move forward. He also does something really remarkable. He asks these men, 12 men on the way over, pick up a boulder, carry it on your shoulder. When you get to the other side, pile them up. Why would we do something like that? 12 rocks. He goes, so when you look at it, you can remember what I did for you. We always forget. Another reminder, don't forget what God has done for you. When your children see it, let them know what these rocks mean. We'll get to the rocks again before we're done. Chapter 5, if you have your Bible open. I made an error here. It's not 5:1, it's 5:9. In verses 1 through 8, the men are circumcised. Apparently they were not. These group of men were not during the 40 years while they were in the wilderness. So God has the people circumcise the men. And in verse 9 it says, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'Today I've rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you.'" So the place has been called Gilgal to this day. What happened here? What happened here? They crossed the river, the men were circumcised, the reproach of Egypt was gone. Clearly, Egypt would only be a faint memory from this point forward. The fear and the doubt and rebellion that their predecessors had against God would be gone. This is a transitional point in the people of Israel. The old is gone. The bondage is gone. The naysayers are not even alive anymore. This is a new chance for you folks. This is a new beginning. You are standing on the brink of a new life here on the other side of the Jordan. The reproach that has held you in bondage all this time no longer exists. So, think differently. Trust me, because we're going somewhere. Hold on to the roller coaster because we're going for a ride. Okay. Wow. That had to be some day to be there, to experience that. They had a second chance to believe in a God that their parents did not believe in, to trust in a God that their parents would not believe in or trust, to see the glory of the God that their parents saw, but they exchanged it for something less. They wanted to go back to Egypt. They were standing in a moment and a chance to finally live in peace, but more than that, to live in promise. It's here, guys. It's here. For them then, for us always, until he comes. The promise is for us. The only thing we need to do is to trust. Interesting that the Jordan would be a place of transition. Leadership of Moses to Joshua. Leadership and ministry of Elijah to his student Elisha happened at the Jordan. The ministry of John the Baptist from himself to Christ happens at the Jordan. There's a Jordan in everybody's life where we have an opportunity for transitioning from one place to another in the Lord. It happens every time we trust him. We can have that Jordan experience by moving forward, trusting in his word. Joshua 6, verse 20. You know the story. They were told by God to march around Jericho once every day for 6 days, not to say a word. On the seventh day, you march around 7 times, and when I tell you, you blow those trumpets and you shout at the top of your lungs. And this is exactly what they did. In verse 20, when the trumpet sounded, the people shouted at the sound of the trumpet. When the people gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed, so every man charged straight in. They took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword everything living in it. Men, women, young, old, cattle, sheep, donkeys. So Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, "Go to the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her." So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her. They brought out the entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. In verse 25, but Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. Now, I can tell you, I have read this passage at least 100 times in my life. And only today, this morning, did I realize something very special that happened to Rahab. Notice that the word tells us when they took her and her family out, they put her in a place outside the camp. Outside the camp in Old Testament meant you weren't clean. You weren't acceptable. There was something wrong with you. You had a disease or something. They were put outside the camp so the inside wouldn't become polluted. They were put outside the camp. They didn't know God. They weren't of the faith. They did what they were told to do back in probably Leviticus. But look what happens over the time from that event to the penning of the book of Joshua. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. Welcome inside the camp. She was grafted in. A person of no significance, an innkeeper, a prostitute, inside the camp of Israel. I don't know, if that doesn't stir your heart and your mind, make you think about some stuff, it does me. Because you see, God looks at the potential in every one of us, and the possibilities of enjoying His promise are always there, but we have to trust Him. We have to take the step. We have to take the initiative. He doesn't give a hoot what you've done with your life. What He wants to do is something really beautiful when you're done with it and finally give it over to Him. He's speaking to all of us. So a transition happens in this woman's life. Don't know how long it took, but we know that it happened. Something beautiful to this woman and to her family. Rahab, like Caleb, will leave a lasting legacy. We find Rahab mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. In the lineage of Christ, this is also an error on a slide and in your handout. It's Matthew 1:5, not Matthew 1:6. We find her named among 4 women that Matthew took the time to acknowledge. She was in the actual lineage of Christ. She was the mother of Boaz. Her husband was Salmon. They would have a child, Obed. Obed would have Jesse. Jesse would have David. She's right smack in the middle of the lineage. She is among those commended for their faith. Remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about Hebrews chapter 11, the hall of faith. The author lists a ton of people who fought the good fight. A lot of those folks were really messed up too. But Rahab would be mentioned for her faith that she put in action. And there's only one other woman mentioned in that whole chapter, and that would be Sarah. James remembers her in his writing. This I will read, James chapter 2. He talks about Abraham and how righteousness was accredited to him because of his faith and trust that he put in God, and God considered him his friend. He said, in the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies sent to them and sent them off into a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. Rahab was one of the first students who would learn that lesson. Putting my faith into action. She stepped forward. She trusted. She put her faith in the God of Israel, even though she didn't know the God of Israel. And now she is remembered 3 times in the New Testament. Wow. There's a lot of people that lived through those hundreds and thousands of years. The consequence of her faith. Number 1, lives were spared. Hers and her family's. A new hope, a new people, a new home. And how about this? A new God, the true and living God, were the result of placing her trust and her faith in action. She would find herself a husband, as I just mentioned, a man by the name of Salmon. and they would have a family, and her life would be complete. So when we look at the principles of those who have fought the good fight of faith, what do we see in Rahab's life? What was she fighting for? Well, I think her fight was more of a search. She was actually she had to be looking for this God of the Israelites, the person, the God that she only heard in stories, what he had done long ago. There had to be something about this God, because we don't see that in Jericho or anywhere else in Canaan, these things happening. And then something happened just a few weeks or months before. These same people defeat the Amorites. Obviously, this was something that they probably couldn't have even done in their own might if they wanted to. She saw the handiwork of God before, and she wanted to go after it. And unlike the people of Jericho, who were caught dead in their tracks because of fear, I really believe this woman was on a search. Her heart had to be stirred. What would be the object of her pursuit? She had to do something, right, to finish her quest. That would be probably the first time in a long time she ever trusted anyone. Think of her life, if she truly was a prostitute. Where's trust in her relationship with anyone? She's in bondage. She's been enslaved, used by men. Where can trust inhabit a place of exploitation? It can't. But she did something that she probably hadn't done for the first time in a very, very long time. She learned to trust. And wow, what happened because she learned to trust? By what means would she fight? Faith in the God of the Israelites, as far as we can go. She didn't know the God yet, but she put her faith and trust in him. The cost, what would be her risk? Either die at the hands of the Israelites or die at the hand of her king if he found out what she was doing. She was stuck any other way if things went bad. Okay? But she trusted that they would not. She saw the Israelites. They saw what they were doing. I'm going with this team. That would be the price that she would pay. Was it worth the fight? Was it worth the quest? I think everyone knows the answer to that. She, at best, was looking just to live, to get out of Dodge so she can live and her family could live. She got much more than that. She got a home. She had a people. She was grafted in. She had not a God, she had the God, the Lord of hosts, the only true and living God. She would have a family. She would have I don't want to say it, normal life. She had a life that God and only God could give her. So in conclusion, I'll wrap this up. John 14:1, do not let your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. Trust in God, trust also me. That invitation actually about trusting God's been there since the Bible was written. Okay. Everywhere you see, people have been called to trust. His word compels us to trust. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not unto your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge me, and I shall direct what? Your path, right? Trust in me. Trust. I'm God. Hey, there's nobody else bigger than me. That's one of my favorites. So what holds us back? What holds us back? Remember the stones. They were asked to pick up 12 stones, plop them down on the other side, and leave it there so that they can remember. When you and I face struggles and tough times, what is he calling us to do? Remember. Look back at the stones that you laid down behind you when you crossed a difficult time in your life, at a difficult point in your life, a place where you had no hope, but God gave you hope. Look at the stone that you've left behind. Ah, thank you, Lord. I remember. I can handle this because you give me the strength to do it, and we can move forward. One's past does not have to dictate one's future. God meets every one of us where we are, when we meet Him, where we meet Him. Just because I failed here doesn't mean I have to fail there. It's not a stone that is written upon. It's all in our own hands. And what we decide and how we decide what to do with the choices that God has given us. And I will close with one verse, one of my favorite. I never knew what it would mean until later in life. Isaiah 42, 1 through 3. It's the first of 4 servant songs that Isaiah would write. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break. A smoldering wick he will not snuff out. He takes everyone for what we can be when we turn our life over to him. And when we mess up, he doesn't break us. He doesn't snuff us out. He calls us back. This is the kind of God that I want to serve. I don't know about you. I make a lot of mistakes, and I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. It is so good to know that he didn't give me the boot to the sideline. You're rubbish. I'm done with you. And then hear those words. Come back home. Come back home.